Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, where we affirm the lived experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. The tools that you learn here will help you confidently address racial toxicity at work, put that imposter syndrome to the side, stand in your power, and resist racial gaslighting. I'm your host, Whitney Knox Lee, a Black mother to Black boy children, a civil rights attorney, and an anti-racism educator and trainer. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're glad you're here. Episodes are published every week. Make sure you go back and listen to our past episodes. All right, here we go. All right, welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. I am here today with Kerrien Suarez, who's the president and CEO of one of my favorite resource organizations, Equity in the Center. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about who she is and what she does and what Equity in the Center does. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is the educational variety of Impostrix Podcast show. And so I'm looking forward to getting into it. So welcome, Kerrien.
Thank you so much, Whitney. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've been with Equity in the Center since the fall of 2016. And our work focuses on capacity building around race equity. So we support leaders and organizations in building what we coined a race equity culture. So in 2017 and into 2018, we did research with about 190 leaders across the nonprofit sector. So folks from nonprofit organizations, as well as philanthropy, social enterprises, folks in the social impact space. And we looked at the steps organizations took to center equity in their culture and to operationalize equity. And so we designed and published a paper on the race equity cycle, which outlines how organizations can shift their work from awake to woke to work in mitigating race-based disparities in their organizational culture. And so we publish the paper, we do capacity building around it, we curate resources, some of which we design ourselves, but many of which are designed by our colleagues that we disseminate within our network to support leaders and organizations in building a race equity culture.
Right. So I believe it was through another organization that I learned about Equity in the Center. I immediately signed up for the newsletter, and you all send out just such rich information. The resources and the learning material is really, really helpful for me. So I just want to thank you for that and encourage listeners. I'm going to link Equity in the Center in the show notes. And so you all will be able to just click on that, learn more about Equity in the Center. Definitely get on the listserv because it's great. I'm constantly reading all of the materials and all the things. So I appreciate you all for that.
We try to create like a newsletter and then a body of work that provides folks with exactly what you just described. So I'm glad it lands that way for you.
It does. It does. And so I like to ask my guests at the beginning of the show to share with us the identities that they bring to the conversation so that listeners know like what perspective we're coming from. So can you share with us what identities you bring?
Sure. Black woman, mother, spouse, daughter. Many years ago, maybe at the beginning of Equity in the Center, I did a similar exercise. And so my response was educated Black woman. Being a mother is definitely, is kind of embedded in that. But if I were, picking single identities, I'd say Black woman, mother at the top of the list, because having a Black son very much changes your perspective. And I have a son, I also have a daughter. But educated Black woman sums it up because I think it speaks to my privilege and the role that I have had the opportunity to take at Equity in the Center, and just how I've navigated the world and how I was raised and supported by other educated Black women.
Yeah, thank you. So with your background, I am just so excited to get your perspective and to learn from you around this concept of a white dominant culture And so I would love for you to talk to us about that. And I'll say to listeners that when I emailed Kay about what the topics were going to be today, the language that I used was white supremacy culture. And that's language that was initially used by Dr. Tema Okun in her work and in the work of her colleagues, that has since been rolled back a little bit for a variety of reasons, which I recently wrote about in the newsletter, and which I'll post the links and everything so that folks can go and see. But what I've experienced is that language can be basically off-putting, or like put up a wall, I think, to some of the progress that we're able to make. And so Kay responded saying, "Yes, Whitney, I am happy to talk about these topics, but I no longer use that language. And this is the language that I use instead." So talk to us about white dominant culture.
Sure, thanks. There is a lot to unpack with the term, with the article that Tema Okun wrote and has really gone viral worldwide. So I will say that there is no rolling back the influence of that article and the pervasiveness of the phrase, because the article so you can't unring a bell. So
Right.
whenever I have the opportunity, I try to talk about, so why say white dominant culture instead, or why talk about how white supremacy manifests in organizational culture? Because on the one hand, the words white supremacy culture do put up the wall that you mentioned for some folks, and that was a consideration when we published the paper in 2018. So in the paper early on, we name white supremacy and then shift thereafter to using white dominant culture because we wanted people to finish reading the paper. And the way white supremacy lands with folks, often with white folks, is that it's very aggressive and it makes the reader feel like they are a white supremacist. And that's Hitler. Those are the folks down in Charlottesville appropriating tiki torches. Those are white supremacists, the KKK. White supremacy is sort of the system in which we exist. It's like the air we breathe, the water we swim in. And so using white dominant culture can allow some folks who need to become part of the conversation to be pulled into it. And that decision that we made back then, and I think making a decision based on the wall that folks throw up, that can center white people. And it's important as we sort of fight for racial justice and race equity that we, in as much as we can, when not having, for example, a conversation with a group of white folks where you're trying to manage this dynamic, our broader work shouldn't center white folks. It should center Black folks, Indigenous folks, people of color. But this is an issue around which we had to manage, and that's reflected in the language of our paper where we use white dominant culture. The larger issue that I've been focused on recently in terms of like thinking for myself, talking about it with the Equity in the Center team and talking to other colleagues is really well reflected in the Forge article that I shared with you. So it came out earlier this year. It was a group of colleagues having a discussion about the original article and the use of the term white supremacy culture. It was moderated by Lori Villarosa, who's the executive director of the Philanthropic Initiative for Race Equity, Sean Thomas Breitfeld, who's the co-director of Building Movement Project and a member of our board, was also part of that conversation, along with about 4 other social and racial justice leaders. And they talked about the conflation of white supremacy and white supremacy culture, number one, and the misuse and weaponization of the term currently, particularly with regard to leaders of color, Black leaders and Black women. So in organizations nationwide, I'll focus on the US context because that's where we are. There are a lot of folks, including folks of color, weaponizing the term white supremacy culture, weaponizing the characteristics outlined in the article against folks of color because they're not grounding themselves in an analysis of structural racism and white supremacy. So the shortest answer to why I don't use the term is folks need to focus on white supremacy. And in my experience, when leaders in organizations are relatively early in their journey to understand the distinction between diversity, inclusion, and equity, 3 different concepts that are cumulative in terms of moving from diversity to inclusion to measurable equity, equity being the absence of, in this case, race-based disparities, they don't actually understand the distinction between white supremacy and quote unquote white supremacy culture, which is the manifestation of white supremacy in organizational culture, not a separate thing. And so Lori Villarosa has advanced this intentional conversation within sort of the community of practitioners that I'm a part of for a couple of years. And she's really pushed my thinking on it. And over the past couple of years, I've stopped using the term. And so I distinguish it in the way I just did. So the characteristics that Okun outlines are a reflection of how white supremacy shows up in organizational culture, not something different. And I've worked with some organizations who attach to the term, then start building their internal work around dismantling white supremacy culture as if it were something different than white supremacy. And we need everyone to be focused on dismantling this broader system of white supremacy in which we all operate and in which we're all complicit, white folks and people of color, just like women are complicit in perpetuating the hierarchy because that's critical to its design and perpetuation. We need to be focused on that. So
right. So it's almost like using white supremacy culture itself is a distraction. Is that what you would say? Or
I think it is a distraction in a way from the core issue, which is white supremacy. Because often what happens when you listen to conversations about quote unquote white supremacy culture, they begin using those three words instead of the words white supremacy. What you're talking about is white supremacy and the way it might manifest, the way it does manifest in organizational culture. So for example, with binary thinking, but white supremacy culture per se is not something different than white supremacy. And folks that are just beginning to learn and go on an equity journey have difficulty making that distinction, which is why I stopped using the term. Because what I kept hearing is people being laser focused on quote unquote white supremacy culture and not talking about the broader structure of white supremacy that is the context for racism, institutional racism, and how it shows up in institutional organizational culture. Because that's what Okun was writing about. Manifestations in organizational culture, characteristics of organizational culture, not the broader structure. And we need to stay focused on the existence, our complicity in the broader structure. And then if we're leaders in an organization trying to build a race equity culture, how do we mitigate that within our institutions? And at that point, we can look at characteristics, whether it's the ones in Okun's article or things that we learn through an assessment of our own organizational culture, to have an explicit conversation about the ways in which white supremacy manifests in our organizational culture and the work that we can do to dismantle those practices.
Right. And so the kind of weaponizing of the characteristics that we mentioned before, correct me if I'm wrong, as a matter of fact, I think you said this, was the issue of using the characteristics without context and then using those characteristics, against leaders of color in some instances. And I will say that that's easy to do. Like, that's an easy way to stir up some stuff, these characteristics. And one of the ones that's commonly talked about with this discussion is the importance of the written word. And I know commentators have talked about like how people use that characteristic as a way to say, okay, well, we don't need written policy in our organization.
Exactly.
Because if we have written policy in the organization, then we're being white supremacist. And that's not the case. You're missing the point. You need the context of being able to understand that everything around, we are in this structure of white supremacy. And so what do we do now, as you said, to mitigate, to make sure that the organization as we're running it is racially equitable?
Yeah. And I'm glad you named that characteristic. It's the one that folks name most often, because there's a lot of turbulence around it. I'll just say that. There's so much to unpack here. So on the one hand, with worship of the written word, folks, yes, we shouldn't have written policy. We shouldn't have written reports. One of my colleagues, Sean Thomas Breitfeld, who I mentioned was part of that Forge article and is on our board, will often use the example of individuals using that particular characteristic to shirk accountability. So because worship of the written word is named in the article, I shouldn't be held accountable, say, for example, through the submission of a report for work that I was supposed to do. And individuals are saying often frequently to leaders of color and Black leaders like myself, I simply am not going to do this for the reason that you said. This is part of white supremacy culture and you're operating within it. And you essentially are oppressing me with this request for a document or a request for accountability in any way, shape, or form in some context. You can't make me do this because of this article and the characteristics that it outlines. And we all have to continue to do our work. We will continue to write. But if you're working to build a race equity culture, as we call it, what you would do within an organization is make sure that there is more than one modality and that writing is just one of the modalities through which you can demonstrate your practice or your expertise or your impact, or did you complete the work? So this is an example I like to give. So if an institution is moving away from worship of the written word, meaning everything that we do has to be easily translated into like clear, concise bullet points, typo-free language. And unless you can communicate your work to me in that format, it doesn't count, because that's the only way that we can communicate about the work that we do, or our impact, as folks say, putting impact in quotation marks. If you're working toward building a race equity culture, writing would be one option. You could also send your manager a voice note, for example. You could also request a stand-up meeting or a quick phone call or a quick Zoom in this virtual world. And having more than one modality, one of which is always going to be writing, is more inclusive. It is more accessible for folks who are neurodivergent. So for example, folks who may have dyslexia or another learning disability have been struggling with worship of the written word for some time. They may not always share their challenge or their diagnosis, but turning around 3 to 5 clear and concise bullet points in whatever number of hours that the manager gave them has been a challenge, and it has been consistently showing up in their performance evaluations. So this is not just about racial equity. This is about inclusion and accessibility across a range of identities. Another thing I'll note is that people of color will sometimes get really sensitive around worship of the written word because we're not allowed to make typos. So another example would be if English is not my first language. If my email, if my report is not completely correct grammatically, no typos, I won't get the job as a Black person, a brown person, someone who doesn't speak English as their first language. I will not be given the benefit of the doubt. Whereas a white identifying individual who sends their cover letter with an email that has a typo or has typos in their cover letter will get passed through, and folks who look like me get dinged. And we know this to be true because it has happened to us. So it's not black and white or binary, if we're going to use a characteristic from the original article. It's really nuanced. And a lot of folks of color who have been successful within these structures of white supremacy and how they manifest in organizations often don't want to dive into them any more than their white colleagues because of how they have had to assimilate to be successful. And for Black and brown leaders, the standards around making progress around equity are miles beyond those of, for example, their white predecessor. So this comes up in the Forge article. So the weaponization of these characteristics is, I'm going to more aggressively demand of you, Whitney, that you not use the written word, that you not use binary thinking, because you are Black. So I'm going to demand more of you, that you achieve equity and make progress toward it today, yesterday, because of who you are and how you present. Whereas I would never make those demands of someone who looks differently than you, someone who might be of color but identifies as part of another racial or ethnic group, or someone who identifies as white. And these demands are coming from other folks of color because, as you and I talked about, we are all operating within a system of white supremacy and complicit in it. So white supremacy wants me as a Black woman to demand the most of you as a fellow Black woman and to sort of nail you to the wall and push you on your failure to make progress on equity in, say, the past 12 months when I did not push your predecessor who might have identified as white or been part of another racial or ethnic group that also identifies as being of color. I'm going to push you much harder and weaponize these characteristics in a much more damaging way that is counter to my stated purpose. So those are all the things that are coming up across the sector, and the Forge article outlines it really clearly.
Yeah, and I'll say readily that I am guilty of that. Absolutely. And I think for me, it's having a higher expectation of someone who I think has a similar experience or had a similar experience than me, and wanting more from them to, I don't know, maybe as a showing of solidarity or maybe as a showing of responsibility, maybe of, I don't know, any number of things. But that expectation is not necessarily one that I have on white people. And so it's interesting. It's helpful for me that you even, used that example specifically because I have certainly done that and not been able to identify that that's what I was doing, or the unfairness maybe of that perspective, and essentially not allowing the same grace that I allow, white people. Now, the difficulty that I have with it is that I allow too much grace. Going back to what we were saying before around shifting the terminology is like, I don't want to center your comfort as a white person in this work. Like, I'm concerned about centering the experiences of Black folks, of Indigenous folks, and of other folks of color. And so finding the balance of having certain expectations of certain people based on what I perceive their experience and background to be, but also not, weaponizing some of these characteristics or this body of work, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. And I have done it. I think we can all agree with you there, because that's what white supremacy wants us to do. That's what we're socially conditioned to do, to demand more of Black folks, particularly of Black women, Black and brown folks, and particularly of women. There's so much in what you said. One thing I'll note is everyone doesn't want to be free. Another board member of ours, Geraldine Coffey, who runs the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, she and I were trading messages about this. And so she said, everyone who looks like us, so to speak, or is of color, doesn't necessarily want to be free, doesn't actually know that freedom, liberation is a goal or is possible. They may just want more within a system of white supremacy. And I have to say that, in years past in my life, that was my orientation. I was explicitly trying to assimilate as much as possible and get my bona fides together within the context of white supremacy culture so that I could get a job and be successful and be financially secure and get access to spaces that people who look like me had not historically been permitted to enter.
Mm-hmm.
And that is trying to get more. I didn't have an analysis of structural racism, but I for sure knew what it was like to be a Black person in America as an individual, to have looked at my family. And that doesn't translate, as you were saying, well, because you look like me or I have some assumptions about you. That does not translate necessarily to any understanding or any analysis of structural racism, to an understanding of one's complicity as a person of color in white supremacy, to the broader system and structures that uphold white supremacy. Just because I'm Black, I totally, absolutely know what it's like to be a Black person. And I may not have the analysis that is going to yield the type of feedback that you're looking for. And even when I do come with all of that, like I'm here for liberation. I know it takes time to get there. We've got to work toward equity, you know, and justice before we get to liberation. I still have to turn the Titanic, just like my white or other identifying predecessor did. And folks don't give you the grace. So even if I say all the right things and I have the right analysis in terms of, say, how to build a race equity culture, how to dismantle white supremacy, I still have to go through all of the steps in terms of moving a board, moving an institution, sort of leading work that takes years. And a great deal of emotional labor. So I'm not going to be able to give you what you want in 12 months because it's literally not possible for me as a Black or brown person or for a white or other identifying colleague, because this work takes years. And yet folks think that, well, the CEO is a person of color now, or the CEO is Black. We're finally going to get all of these things done. One colleague of mine who is a CEO said that members of her team, mostly Black, but also brown members of her team, tried to hold her accountable for not hiring only Black and brown people. So it's like, well, you're in charge now. This place has been predominantly white for however long. And so we've hired like 5 people and one of them was Black and one was brown. And like, that is woefully insufficient. And she was like, well, did you talk to my predecessor in this way or just to me? And there could be a million different reasons why it fell out that way, all of which are rooted in white supremacy. Because again, that's what we're working with. But the way we are called on the carpet and disrespected, you know, is unique to our role in society and the comfort that folks have in talking to us a certain kind of way, which I've absolutely experienced in my role, from folks who are Black and from folks who are not Black. Because we are all operating within a system of white supremacy, and the stereotypes and the devaluation of us is in our amygdala. And so we all have to be really vigilant about that constantly every day, because we're socialized to treat ourselves poorly and to devalue ourselves. And so how do we work together to, you know, build a race equity culture, to center Indigenous and Black folks, and to try to work toward liberation and freedom? And so many of my colleagues have, you know, taken over the helm at organizations, have tried to shift culture, change benefits, root the work in values, and are challenged consistently in doing so. Because when you offer folks who are operating within a system of white supremacy liberatory practices, they do not know how often to receive them, because liberation is so far outside of our lived experience. We've never been free. We live in a society that was not designed to be liberatory. It was designed to be inequitable. And so I've experienced this at Equity in the Center in terms of our team with the organizations that we support. And I've heard stories from colleagues where you offer something to the team and there's a state of disbelief that you are actually being truthful, that what you're offering is real. And it's just a reflection of how deeply oppressed we are. Yeah. So we're all working, you know, doing the little bit that we can. But I think for some of us, I'd say for myself, to some extent, though I've had the benefit of talking to folks who have been trying this and working at it and practicing for longer, you are still surprised that this is what happens when we try to be free. But then if you think about it, this is the logical outcome of attempting to be free, because we're not supposed to be free. So if I offer you something liberatory, if I try to build something liberatory with you, folks will fight that as part of being inculcated and socialized within a system of white supremacy. So we have to work together to undo that. And I have to work every day to undo that instinct in myself, to center whiteness, to make myself small, to make white folks comfortable. There's still an instinct there that is part of my socialization as part of society more broadly that I have to learn I have to undo it in myself. And so we're all trying to undo these things as individuals, as individuals and institutions. And so with Awake to Woke to Work, what we were hoping to provide is sort of a toolkit for leaders, for individuals and institutions that they can use to begin undoing racism and dismantling white supremacy within their institution. We have to support individuals in an institutional role. So if we circle the drain on the implicit bias that we hold as white folks, as folks of color, that's not going to help me know how to mitigate institutional bias in policy. We need structures and supports and capacity building to do that as we go about our daily work, because just like we don't know how to be free, we don't know how to operationalize equity in our jobs because we're not supposed to. So it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. And even, I mean, it's a balancing act, I think, in some ways. And in, some of the ways that we've already talked about with language and, recognizing that race equity work is cross-racial. And it's not work that just needs to be done by white people or just needs to be done by Black people or just needs to be done by any other group of people. Because we are in a multiracial society, we have to be able to communicate with each other in a way that allows us to get beyond the discomfort. And I think, going back to how whether we use, language like white supremacy culture or white dominant culture, or other, calling people racist or using the word, racist is sometimes a block for people. And so it's like sometimes needing to balance leaving enough comfort that people will read on, like you were saying about the report, leaving enough comfort so that people can feel like they can continue in the learning journey, while still calling the thing in a way so that we're not escaping what the reality, what the truth of the situation is, what the work that is going to need to be done to help kind of rectify some of these situations.
Yeah, that's point well taken. And calling someone a racist, I mean, I don't know in an institutional context, but I would also say that within a societal context, if we're talking about organizing toward liberation, calling someone a racist isn't going to help get you there because you're antagonizing them. So I'm not interested in centering the comfort of white folks or the comfort of folks of color who are assimilated and have privilege and are just upholding the system. There's a way to name individual and collective complicity in racism without calling someone a racist. That's not productive. I don't do that in my work. No one would hang around to finish whatever it is that you started in terms of your talk or your project if that's your approach. Guilt and shame, though understandable outcomes of processing one's complicity in white supremacy or just how racism has unfolded over centuries, that's a natural reaction. Like, so is devastation. And those are not productive emotions if you're seeking to dismantle racism and build a race equity culture within an organization. We need to harness momentum in a different way. So I can name your complicity in white supremacy. I will often name folks' complicity in white supremacy by using myself as an example, because it doesn't make sense for me to go around and ask people to do work or to ask hard questions about complicity that I haven't asked about my own life. And so the way that I got to equity in the center, I'll often say, is as part of a deepening understanding of my own privilege and my complicity in upholding a system from which I was gaining some financial and educational benefit. Being an only or a few in a predominantly white environment. I kind of looked around at one point and I was like, well, I don't think I'm helping. I'm the token in this environment who is helping the system to continue as it is with a little bit more diversity. And so what does that mean for, the rest of my life and for the work that I do and how I talk to my colleagues about things that are actually about race as we work with nonprofits that serve Black and Brown communities. What does that mean if I am complicit in their not naming race as part of that work? And so I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. And I had to think really hard about why I went to the schools that I went to, why I made certain choices to be assimilated so that I could gain access to certain things and what that meant. One thing it does mean for me is that I have had the literal privilege of doing this job. I wouldn't be able to do this job if I didn't have the resume that I have. And so that's why I say I use myself, because I'm a good example of what you can do when you have access to privilege. So, this is me trying to do the best that I can with the spaces I've been able to enter professionally. But I don't think that I would be here talking to you at least about equity in the center's work if I had not made certain choices that made me complicit in white supremacy over years.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I say this often. I went to law school for the power, for the privilege that was going to give me. And then, this was my conflict. It is my conflict working within nonprofits, and the nonprofit industrial complex is the reality that I'm being funded off of somebody else's poverty or off of somebody else's whatever the issue is. For me, it was poverty. And then, the last couple of years as I've been working as a civil rights attorney in jails and prisons, receiving the funding in order to help people who are in jails and prisons. And not that, I mean, obviously these people need justice advocates. But like, what is my role within the system? And I can't say that system has clean hands. I don't think it does. I think it's a product of capitalism. And at the same time, I'm benefiting. I have a salary, I have health insurance. I have all of these things that certainly the people that I'm working for don't have. So it is that has been something in my life that I'm constantly trying to reconcile, and I think is just a fact of life at this point. And to what you were saying leads me to go back and kind of evaluate, okay, well, now that I have this power, that I worked hard for, that I worked hard assimilating for, that I worked hard in actual school for, that I, not that it's been easy, not that it's just been handed to me or anything like that, but it's power and it's privilege and it's currency of our system of white supremacy. And so now what? Now what? So I wonder if you can give us some tools that we can use to help interrupt our own complicity within these systems, so that as we're moving forward and we're noticing our space within these systems, what we can do.
So I wouldn't be representing Equity in the Center if I didn't recommend that folks go to our website and download our paper to find some recommendations on what they can do. So essentially, there's the race equity cycle. We talk about how organizations move from awake work to work. And the literal purpose of the paper was to organize best practices, so to speak. That is in and of itself a capitalist term, but characteristics, tactics, activities that senior leaders, organizations, managers demonstrate in order to measurably shift their organization toward equity. So when you download the paper, the race equity cycle has 7 levers, and the levers include like senior leaders, organizational culture, board of directors, managers, data, and so on. And so for each lever, there is a matrix that outlines characteristics for awake, woken work. So what I'd recommend is that you go there, if you're a senior leader, look at the senior leaders lever and find yourself, and then think about the actions you can take to move the work forward. If you're thinking about your organization as a whole, go to the organizational culture lever and find your organization. And so what the tactics framed as awake, woken work do is they cast a vision for the work moving forward. Now, doing the work requires a lot of support, a lot of learning. So that's one recommendation I would make. Beyond that, I'd invite folks to consider the questions that you and I just said we asked ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in our position, whether it's as an attorney, as a nonprofit executive, as a banker, in whatever capacity you're functioning, am I helping? So we all know if you disaggregate the data, our people and Indigenous folks are always at the bottom when you disaggregate outcomes. So we have the worst health, economic, pick a social vertical. In my role, am I working to mitigate those disparities? Or am I helping to uphold a system that sorts us down to the bottom and then lets some of us up to the top if we jump through all of the assimilation hoops? So what am I doing? And maybe I'm a banker, but do I channel resources to communities that might not otherwise get them? How am I taking actions that have systemic effect? Because representation is just the beginning. So maybe you are a leader and you have the capacity to hire more folks of color. And all of us know folks that got an executive role who did just that. And then that's just the beginning. So once you bring more folks in, if you have the capacity to do that, then what you have before you is the really challenging work of inclusion and equity. So then how do you transform organizational policies and procedures? So how can you advocate for the depth of organizational change that yields a narrowing of identity-based disparities in your organization or in society? So I don't think you exactly said this, but like, how are you helping? Are you helping? Because I definitely came to a point one day where I was like, I'm certainly not. I'm
Yes.
certainly not. And then seek out opportunities to learn how you can deepen your capacity around equity in your role in society more broadly, and to do what you can from where you sit. And for a lot of folks, gaining economic power, like making a lot of money, is a means to an end, because maybe when I have the money, then I can make different choices and do other things with it for my community or for my people. And the way the system works is that lots of folks who have that plan never exit the system. So what am I
It's too
doing? And
good.
it's too good. And my job, maybe my role is to write large checks. I don't want to, and we all have to sort of have this practice of not judging other people. There is a role for people who write large checks. So all I'm saying is, wherever you sit, whatever job or role you have, how are you helping? Not just helping to get more people sitting in the seats at the table, but how are you helping in whatever capacity that you can to flip the table, to dismantle it, and to build another table at which people who look like you, if you're a person of color, are not considered to be inherently deficient? Because that's part of the problem with, like, well, let's get another seat at the table. You're getting another seat at the table of white supremacy. And shouldn't you feel so lucky to be here, as we treat you as a person of lesser value after you jump through all these hoops? So getting folks to the table is just the first step. The ultimate goal, if we're going for equity and liberation, is to build a different table collaboratively in solidarity within a different system. And so we're very far from that. But I think that was a big switch for me. Just playing along to get more is never going to get me free. It's never going to get us free. And any of us can still be killed at any moment. So I think with that, I'm speaking to other Black people and people of color. Assimilation will not save you. It won't save your children. So what can you do to dismantle the system?
Wow. It will not save you, and it will not save your children. Thank you so much, Kay, for joining us today. Where can we find Equity in the Center's work?
Oh, equityinthecenter.org. And there you can find all of our handles. So we are on Facebook, Instagram. We withdrew from the entity formerly known as Twitter. And please sign up for our newsletter and follow our work. So did not want to continue to be part of that platform. And that's part of learning how to live and move and operate in your values. And I think that's a good example, like the decision to leave Twitter, of something that you can do in your values as a leader when you gain power. And, power is relative. So that's just power within one small nonprofit organization. But I think that's an example of so how can you help? What are you doing? So equityinthecenter.org.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I will make sure to put all of the stuff, all of the information in the show notes and also in the Impostrix podcast newsletter, Validating Voices. Thanks,
Thank
Kay.
you so much, Whitney. I appreciate you.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to listen to past episodes and to subscribe. Also, feel free to leave me a message. I want to know what you think about this show. So you can do that by leaving a review, or you can do that by sending me an email at impostrixpodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is for me, and this podcast is for you. And I hope that you're leaving this podcast and this experience feeling validated, because that's the goal. Be validated. Until next time.